According to the FBI, the national murder rate has been steadily rising over the past few years, but the number of homicide cases solved has also hit an all-time low. Anne Marie has a closer look at the numbers.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. In 2021, there were about 22,000 murder cases. And unfortunately, only about half of those cases will likely be solved based on the current nationwide clearance rate. That's what they call it. So it's actually at the lowest point in decades. A CBS News investigation found that only about 51% of all murders in 2020 were solved. That's compared to 81% about 50 years ago. So just taking a look at what that means, though, it's a problem that's impacting some states more severely than others. The redder the state is here on the map, the worse the homicide clearance rate is. So Michigan police, for example, pretty red, right? Michigan police only have a 39% clearance rate between 2015 and 2020. Kentucky, on the other hand, has a 79% clearance rate, which is among the highest in the nation. Now, the clearance rates change dramatically when you include the race of the victim. CBS News analyzed the FBI's supplemental homicide data and found that in 2020, 87% of murders involving white victims, they were solved, while only 67% involving Hispanic victims were solved and 59% involving Black victims were solved. And there's an important distinction to make when we talk about the clearance rate and the metrics to determine them. They can be impacted by, different factors besides just there was an arrest. Here's what you need to know. Cases can be closed under exceptional circumstances. So what is that? It's like if the suspect is dead, or perhaps serving a prison sentence already. Also, other issues like if witnesses or the other victims who weren't killed, if they don't want to cooperate with the investigation of the crime, that can be problematic. And this can skew the data on just how many murderers are actually arrested. So after investigating the Chicago Police Department's data, CBS News found that half of all 2020 homicides cases were exceptionally cleared. It means that, it was case closed, but no one was arrested. And there we go. So what does that mean? Only 50% of the cases had an arrest in order to conclude it. This means that there are an awful lot of cases that are going unsolved. Police told CBS News that the biggest factor in increasing the clearance rate is actually you and me. It's about encouraging the cooperation between police and citizens to solve the cases. Glad.
All right, Anne-Marie, thank you very much. Let's dig a little deeper into this data and what's driving these numbers. Dr. Jeffrey Butts is here with us in Studio 57. He is the director of the Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Dr. Butts, good to see you.
Hi, good to be here.
So you just heard us go through the data. From your perspective, what's driving the murder rate up, and why are these cases not getting solved as much?
Yeah. Of course, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to point to many factors that are driving the numbers up. So we all experienced the pandemic. We also need to remember that just before the pandemic, we were at an all-time low. So compared to the 90s, we're 1/3, sometimes 1/4 as much in terms of violent crime and homicides. And I know that people are in the media all the time saying, well, progressives always say that. It's not as bad as it used to be. But the reason you point that out is just to keep in mind that when you're at a very low number, percent change can sound explosive. And if you're affected by it directly in your family, in your neighborhood, you feel it. But as a researcher and ideally as a policymaker, you focus on the overall phenomenon and the trends, and you implement policies to stop those trends and reverse them. We're not hearing so much about that. We hear people exploiting the crime issue, not so much proposing sound, effective policies and then being willing to test them to see if they were correct.
So how do you account for the racial disparities, though? You saw sort of our little setup there when it comes to solving crimes and the clearance rate.
Yes, well, you identified the key components. So there's police resources, and then there's community cooperation. If we're ever in the point where our only safety in a community is a function of police resources, we are in deep trouble. So communities keep communities safe. If you have enough people willing to talk to the police, willing to participate in an investigation, they can make their way toward an explanation and find a perpetrator and make an arrest. Sometimes, though, that's nearly impossible, especially in areas where shootings can happen in even be a crowded neighborhood, but now it's perfectly normal to be walking around in a neighborhood with a mask on and people can't tell who you are. So even video may not point to the perpetrator. It's gotten more difficult.
You know what I felt, though, with the sort of little end there when we talk about community involvement? It felt a little bit like blaming the victim. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
the police play a role in creating and nurturing that relationship, don't they?
Yes. And ideally, that would be a huge part of their job, to build strong community relationships, to build trust, treat people with decency, and to foster the kind of connection with community residents that you need to have safe communities. And you're right. Having worked in the crime field for 40 years now, the word race comes up all the time. It's America. The word race comes up a lot.
Right.
But in the crime area especially, there are a lot of what people call dog whistles.
Yeah.
Sure.
Secret signals.
Yeah.
When you hear politicians talk about cities, the urban crime
Yes,
rate,
yes.
all that is meant to send a signal to their voter base. But it's misleading to talk about cities and urban every time you talk about crime.
So let me first ask you about this broken windows theory. And there was an article in The Atlantic which broke down the concept by saying this, quote,
This is an older article.
this is an older article,
the
yeah. One unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares, and so breaking more windows costs nothing. That was written in the 1980s. Now, I'm asking this from a personal perspective because as a child in New York City, I remember squeegee men, right, which were a real problem, a real nuisance. I remember once my dad, who tried to sort of drive away from one of them, one guy took out a cinder block and threw it at his car just because he wouldn't allow him to squeegee his window, right? I remember that the crime element in New York City, as a child, felt to me greater than it does today. But I want you to put into context, and that's just from a child's perspective, right? You feel like, okay, you're a little kid, you're a little frightened to walk around on 42nd Street. Now people, are there. It's completely different than it was when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s. Can it be effective today in fixing some of the issues that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Because I wonder if increased police interaction for minor offenses could also be problematic.
Yes. And today, there'd be a good chance that we would all see that person throw a cinder block through the window because someone would be on the corner with their phone and capture it on a video. So there's also the number of incidents that we all see. It used to be you didn't experience that directly unless you were in a neighborhood where it was happening. Now we all see it. We all saw George Floyd. We all saw Eric Garner. We all see these things. The concept of broken windows that came out 40 years ago, unfortunately, was immediately distorted. So the idea...
What was distorted? From the politicians or from people who didn't agree with it?
Who knows?
Okay.
They work together.
What was it supposed to be, and then how was it distorted?
Yeah.
So the concept of broken windows was not new. People have been writing 150 years ago about social disorder and the need for communities to feel safe and look safe and pay attention to little things. So that was not new. What was distorted about it was people, elected officials, also in law enforcement, decided, if broken windows lead to worse problems, let's really go after the people breaking the windows, metaphorically speaking.
Right.
So they treated minor offenses as if they could lead to more serious offenses. Eric Garner is the perfect example of that.
Selling loose cigarettes.
Yeah. Someone was choked to death for selling loose cigarettes. And the theory would be, within certain circles, we have to do this on the minor offenses or we'll be dealing with more serious offenses. That's a distortion because the idea was not go after the people. It was, let's pay attention to neighborhoods and quality of environment. And if we see broken windows, let's fix them. If we see abandoned buildings, let's deal with that. Plant trees. There's good research showing that a neighborhood with more trees and plants is actually safer. We don't often see politicians talking about the need to build safe communities. They talk about the need to go after criminals.
But wait, doctor, let me play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. Is it the police, if that is the way it was meant to be, is it the police's job to go out and make neighborhoods better?
No.
Right? I mean, in other words, if you say to a police officer, hey, we're implementing this system, anybody caught breaking a window, should be arrested. Then they're going to say, oh, those are the marching orders. I guess I have to do that, as opposed to what you're talking about is a community itself taking, sorry, Emery, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, no, but you're basically saying it. I mean, we're going back to this refrain that we heard not too long ago about reimagining public safety, reimagining policing. That, yes, like that kind of policing where you're like, here are your marching orders, these are the infractions you're looking for, and I'm going to keep track of your success rate based on that is
promotions,
different than what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on how many crimes got reported to us and how many people did we arrest, focus on how many incidents were reported in the community and how people feel. Ideally, public safety would be constant checking in with neighborhoods. How's it going? Are you okay going to the store at night? How are your kids going to school? There'd be that constant checking in with the public perception of safety.
You sound quite radical.
Yes,
Doctor.
right. It really does. This is a fascinating conversation. I mean, you know, there's a lot to unpack here. Even what you were saying about the way politicians use crime statistics. I mean, oftentimes many of the, crimes, murders, for example, happen in states where they're generally governed by Republicans. And yet it's easy to point to New York City or to Chicago or to Detroit and say, in Philadelphia, et cetera, as problematic.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah.
So it's a mistake to only use police data to think about public safety. There are alternatives. So the Centers for Disease Control posts data on their website. It's called CDC Wonder. The public can get at it and look at things. One of the things they produce is a count of violent death in counties all over the country. Violent death means shootings, stabbings, bludgeoning, assault, even being pushed in front of a moving vehicle, which here would include a subway. So anything where someone dies because of someone else's action toward them is counted. When you count that way, the most recent numbers we can track between let's say 2018 to 2020 into the pandemic. In the Bronx, which people would call one of the rough areas of New York, the per capita rate of these incidents went from 6 to 8. So 8 per 100,000 was the rate in the Bronx. In Queens, it went up. I didn't write down Queens. In Chicago, it went from 12 to 18. So 18 sounds worse than the Bronx. But Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the county surrounding Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the total population is 70,000 people. The rate went from 29 to 40 per 100,000.
So that's a significant increase.
It's worse than the Bronx.
But you never hear about Pine Bluff, Arkansas. When a politician talks about crime in America, they target Chicago or the Bronx.
And why is that? Do we even have to wonder?
I don't have to wonder.
No, we do not.
Dr. Butts, thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. Please come back.